So welcome to this next revisiting the Whitley Lectures, which is an attempt to go back into, I guess, relatively recent past, but for some of us, still quite a long time ago, that for some of these lectures, and some of us definitely didn't hear them the first time, but perhaps have read them since. Some of us are encountering them for the first time. And what the series is trying to do is trying to say, actually, there's been some good work done by Baptists in the Whitley Lectures, and it's well worth revisiting them to see what they might speak to us today, rather than being those which are kind of given and then forgotten. And so in this latest one, we're revisiting the Whitley Lecture from 2003, so just over 20 years ago, which was entitled Tradition and Renewal in Baptist Life, and it was given by Steve Holmes. And it's a joy that Steve's able to join us for our conversation and engagement as we revisit it. I'm imagining if Steve has found the time, this is probably the first time that he's revisited this lecture as well, maybe in a very long time as well. So it might make it an interesting thing. So normally what we do is just have a first kind of 10 minutes, which kind of just opens up the lecture and perhaps points some questions. And when the person who originally delivered it is with us, we allow that to come to that person. So Steve, if I can ask you, I'll let you know that I was about to ask this question. What were you trying to do in the lecture? Which I guess is my way of saying, can you give us a summary, no more than 5 minutes, because hopefully most people will have read it. What was this lecture trying to do?
Yeah, well, as I said to you when we talked before, Andy, trying to recall 20 years ago what I thought I was trying to do is a little beyond me, especially as it was about the time my first daughter arrived, so I was probably sleep deprived. Yeah, but I published a book in 2002, which was a collection of essays entitled "Listening to the Past: The Place of Tradition in Theology," which really came about because sitting in a random conference bar with my longtime friend Mike Higton, who's now in Durham, he said to me something like, why have you been working on tradition recently? And I said, I haven't, have I? And he kind of took me through 6 or 7 pieces I'd published and pointed out that one way and another, they all revolved around questions of tradition. And so I guess now, of course, Mike did his, of course, if you happen to know, Mike did his own doctoral work on Hans Frey. And so very much in that post-liberal, we need the tradition as a place to stand. And so it was something he was looking for. But I guess this was me engaging with that same sense that we need the tradition as a place to stand, but it's not straightforward for Baptists. Curtis Freeman's done this so well in Contesting Catholicity, where he points out that any Baptist engagement with tradition is always going to be, to some extent, difficult, as we recognize that we need a tradition, but that equally our own the genius of our tradition, the existence of our tradition stands on a certain rejection of tradition, or at least of certain traditioned themes. So I guess the lecture was an attempt to reflect on those kind of questions of how does tradition work, given we need it, how do we receive it, that I've been thinking about in broader theological terms, in a specifically Baptist context. So if you've looked at it, the lecture considers 4 places we might look for renewal: charismatic renewal, Celtic spirituality, the borrowing the worship of the world church and contemplative spirituality, which feels very 2003 right now, but at the time, the Baptist retreat group was actually quite a force in the land, and so the contemplative thing mattered. And I'll take you down the other three if you're really excited. And underlying the lecture is the sense of every tradition as a patchwork of previous renewals, which when I came to look at it again, I was actually really surprised I hadn't, presumably at this point, hadn't read Alistair MacIntyre, because basically every time I've talked about tradition for as long as I can remember, I've talked about MacIntyre's account of tradition as a community of conversation, and that fits pretty well with what I was doing in the lecture. But this is clearly me before I'd actually sat down and read which of the books does three
Virtue.
No, it's not there.
Oh, no,
it's three rival versions, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah. No, I mean, After Virtue obviously is the really significant book, but it doesn't particularly work out traditions there. But I mean, I think MacIntyre would have helped in the argument of the lecture, but I think probably I was groping my way towards some of the things that he had said magisterially before, and so it's not. I don't think it would have reversed anything too much. The lecture kind of turns on a sense that all of these reachings for tradition get transmuted in then contemporary Baptist life into ways of trying to feel an experience of God. And there's a bit of an argument in there which probably goes back to my doctoral work on Edwards about that kind of felt experience as being the key, the kind of the key justification of belief in a post-Enlightenment, modernist, postmodern, whatever, pick a word, reality. And I guess I saw in each of the cases I was looking at in different ways, almost reinvention is probably the kindest way of putting it, or the fairest way of putting it, or re-narration of an ancient tradition that made this experience of God something that was kind of front and center and the key goal. I think probably those four treatments are inappropriately kind of leveled. I think, you can, the argument that some sort of experience of divine touch is relatively central to charismatic movements, I think, is one that stands far better than any argument about Celtic Christianity, which never existed, and if it had existed, certainly didn't involve seeking experience of God. I mean, you immersed yourself in Loch Ness in midwinter to do battle with the water demon who lives there and things like that. But in the lecture as it was, I kind of try to argue that in every case, this is how things have been constructed. And I must confess, when I picked up the lecture last week to look back at it, I had thought that was where I ended. And I discovered that actually, no, it all then turned to a kind of sacramental promise account of divine presence that
Very Coelhoian.
yeah, very Coelhoian. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, the first footnote says that. But which I had completely forgotten. Um, I I don't think I disagree with what I said there. I do think that I didn't see that a kind of doctrinal claim that you do in fact truly encounter the divine in the sacraments is not adequate in the apologetic terms that experience got made to do. And I think that would probably be my biggest criticism looking back at the thing in terms of the argument not working. So yeah, that's where it went.
Yeah. Okay. So Steve, you might give us a little bit more on as we have our conversation going on what it was like to revisit it and hear it again. So for those of us who perhaps have read it for the first time or revisiting it, what did we make of what Steve was trying to do, or what we imagined Steve or was trying to do with this lecture? Anyone want to kick us off?
Steve, I mean, I imagine that things like the Toronto blessing would have been quite high in your mind, because I remember at that time at Spurgeon's, it was just a few years before we were at Spurgeon's, and it was very much the subject of debate, wasn't it? And so I think thinking about it being written in that context, it kind of just really explains what you were trying to get at. I think when I read it earlier today, the question in my mind about the apologetic thing was, how do we in this post everything generation talk to people about the experience of God, or you know, how can we? I mean, I was thinking of a conversation I had with a man in Costa on Monday who said to me, well, I don't believe in God, and then proceeded to ask me a lot of questions about God. I didn't actually even think really, I mean, I talk quite a bit about Jesus, but I didn't think about saying anything about experience and the experiential side of things particularly. I wonder, would you use that as an apologetic outside the church, or is this an apologetic for within the church?
Yeah, good questions. I think the problem with experience as an apologetic in either case is, and this is in the lecture, it's not reliable. You know, but I mean, I guess I know some of you know, and others who may have picked up, I've on my way out of a fairly a debilitating episode of mental health problems, and I didn't have experience of anything for 6 months. I mean, it's not, this is what depression means. It's not you feel bad, you just don't feel. While that's extreme and pathological, that sense that experience is a very depends as much on where we are as on anything that might be really properly happening. I mean, you mentioned the Toronto blessing. I don't know how much that was consciously in my mind, because it had all flared up in '98 and it died down pretty quickly afterwards. And yes, I do remember at Spurgeon's it being a big thing, but I kind of feel it was gone. I remember you know, when that time at Spurgeon's, folk who went up to Queen's Road, Wimbledon, or HTB, and came back talking about this, you know, this wonderful experience they'd had, which seemed to have made them particularly obnoxious. And you know, I won't put names to that. But to put a name, I remember Brian White, who was a good friend of mine, you know, and Brian went up to one of these things, and someone prayed for him. And I was chatting to him about this about a month afterwards, and he said, they prayed for me. I didn't feel anything. There was no experience in that sense. He said, but since then, I've preached 4 times, and every time at least one person has come to faith in Jesus. And you know, and I mean, this is very Edwards. It seems to me that there's lots of spectacular stuff which in fact is just froth. It means nothing. But there is a reality that matters, whether we feel it or not. Now, having said that, I think we're in an interesting place just now. I do some work with Fusion Scotland, who a student ministry, and our folks there, I kind of help on the board, and our folks there recently did a session on assessing the spiritual climate, or some such phrase, which they got some stats and they got some whatever, but it rang very true to what I think I'm seeing. We had a guy, this guy on YouTube, isn't it, Andy?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We had a guy, just call him D, who wandered into our church kind of 15 months ago, January, off the street, one evening service. No contact with us at all before, but he was looking for something and happened to be walking past our church and saw the door was open and came in. About 5 weeks later, he approached our pastor, one of our pastors, Abby, and said, I want to be baptized, which happened. We had an elders meeting the day after. And Abby was saying, I've set up a meeting with him. You know, we're all kind of, doesn't really know what he's talking about, does he? Far too quick. But Abby sat down with him and said, no, he has understood everything that really matters. I have no problem at all. And so we baptized him that Easter, 8, 9, 10 weeks after he'd first walked in the door of the church. And that sort of story seems to me to be coming, if not normal, at least repetitive, in the last year or two post-lockdown. And I imagine it's got something to do with lockdown. I don't know what. And it's really struck me because when I first went into ministry in '96, I was in a church that, you know, had evangelical preaching traditions. I was there as an associate, and people remembered the great days of old. And actually, the church was doing at that time a reasonable job in terms of outreach. But I remember 2 of our leaders almost quite angrily saying, yes, people are coming to faith, but no one comes to faith during the services. And I, you know, to be honest, but they were remembering a time when there was, I guess, a sufficient kind of cultural Christianity in the UK that people feeling a certain sense of need would turn to their local church and would have enough background to respond to an ordinary church service. And I was kind of saying, no, that's gone. That's, forget it. It's not going to happen. Not, you know, not in my lifetime, not my kids' lifetime, not in. And yet it does seem that we are seeing that sort of thing. If you look at the Fusion UK blog, they've been doing one kind of student mission story a week over this academic year, and it's great. I mean, I know a bunch of the folks because I hung around with them, and so in some cases, one case, I know his mum, what really struck me reading through about 30 of those, because I hadn't realized it was starting, so I caught up late, was how much of the story, or how many of the stories being told, were not about student mission. They were about divine mission or divine encounter that the church then, you know, the local church then picked up on. And so there was a lovely story from some student worker, and she was saying, a girl, first year student, arrived in their church, and because she was a student, she kind of had coffee with her and sat down and talked about it, and said, she said to me, when I was packing to come to university, I suddenly saw this Bible that someone had given me when I was a kid. Don't know if this was Gideon's or what, but yeah. And thought, oh, I'll shove it in the case. She said, a few weeks ago, I thought, I ought to read that. And she started at the first page, because you do, if you don't know what you're doing. And she'd read Genesis and half of Exodus, and had come to the conclusion that there was truth and power here, and that she needs to get involved in the church. And I mean, the student worker's comment was, wait till she gets to the gospel, it'll blow her socks off. So you know, there is, it seems to me that there are stories, credible stories like that I'm hearing in ways that I've never heard before just now. And that says something about a climate, a culture. And I don't know quite what we do with that in terms of what's the right apologetic or anything else, because it seems very, very new and different.
But it seems to me what we offer people, though, is where you end up in the lecture, which is we offer them the promise that Christ will be present when we open up the scriptures, when we baptize, and when we gather around the table. And we might offer other stuff around that, but that you know, and what, you know, the story you told of D, what did you do? You baptized him. You welcomed him, I guess, into membership and into that and into that sacramental preaching. So that's, I think
I don't want to downplay that. I think probably I would want to say that we welcomed him into a Christian community. It's a Christian community that revolves around the sacraments and the word. I'd say bipolar, but that has other connotations for me just now. But I don't know. I mean, again, kind of prior to seeing the stories I've just been telling, the thing that had really struck me in terms of what was working in mission was community. Again, it was when we said goodbye to our previous pastor, Andrew Rollinson, we booked out one of the university rooms, and so we had the university staff, and you know, they employ local school kids to do wait tables and serve whatever, and so there was a lad there who was the same year at school as one of our daughters, and because of this, I got to hear his feedback, and he was absolutely blown away by the fact that he'd been in this group of people of however many different nationalities, races, all different ages, who all seemed to like each other. And he'd never seen this before in his life, and was actually asking around. They said they're a Baptist church. Does anyone know who they are? And if I would be allowed to go and visit. And I, you know, I that was the kind of thing I was seeing 5 years ago, I think. I don't claim profound insight, but I do get around and I do hear stories. And so I think there is something about, or there was pre-pandemic, has been something about genuine community. And, you know, if theologically, I'd probably say that the word and the sacraments create the community, but the community is what people see and want. And I think probably 5 years ago, I'd have said that was where we were at in terms of mission to modern UK culture. But it does seem to me that that something is changing, and I don't know what or how. I've not seen enough or thought enough to work out how to make sense of this, but I've heard probably 20 or 30 stories from people who I know in ministry that are all about folk who picked up a Bible without any contact with the church, or who were wandering past the door and walked in. And I just don't think I'd heard a single story like that for 10 years before. So I just think something's changed.
Simon, Edward, you and Gareth, reflections on our conversation at the moment, or back into back with the lecture. And
can I go back into the lecture? I got a sense, not so much that the story of, you know, an encounter with God, but the assurance of God, and I think that came through very strong. And
experience. I mean, I would still stand on that. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on early modern reform stuff because I've done my PhD on Edwards, where the question of assurance is absolutely massive. And again, it's a very John Colwell theme that assurance is hugely significant in pastoral terms. And experience is experience is the way to assurance, is the argument of the lecture, that we assume that experience is the way to assurance. I think probably now I'd want to complicate that rather than just deny it, which is basically what I do in a lecture, because assurance is experience. You know, I mean, assurance is something I feel fundamentally, or believe, or it's not a. I went to a single-sex grammar school where they still had them in Kent in the state system when I was there, and it was every bit as weird as a public school without the benefits. And I remember one of our physics teachers who took us through the equations for the simple pendulum swing. And one of the things this tells you is that if you swing a pendulum, there is no way it will ever rise higher on the swing back than it started with. And he said, okay, do you agree with the math? Is the math right? Yeah. Okay, who believes this? Some lad put his hand up, and he had him out the front. He put a 5-kilo weight on the bottom of a piece of string strung from the ceiling, held it kind of a centimetre from this lad's nose, let it swing. And as it swung back towards him, said, "Do you really believe the math?" And it seems to me that that's assurance. Yes, we'd all been through the math, and we all knew what the math said, but actually, the moment when there's a 5-kilo weight swinging rapidly towards your nose, is when you discover whether you really believe this or not. I mean, I've said in public in a couple of places recently, in my lowest points in health terms recently, somehow I did discover that sense of assurance. And I think some of it was kind of when you've got nothing else, you look around and say, what's left? I wasn't doing very much. There were days I wasn't really getting out of bed. Certainly, whatever discipline of prayer life I ever had was long gone, and so on and so on and so on. And the old those of you at Spurgeon's, that thing that the shield with the hand holding the cross, and et teneo, which he nicked from some devotional writer in the Church of England. I can't remember her name offhand, but I've referenced it somewhere. I hold on and I am held. And somewhere in my absolute depths, that awareness, conviction, assurance that I am held became real for me in a way that it had never been before. And now my life, particularly my recent life, is definitely not a model of how one should do discipleship or how one should narrate discipleship. But I think one of the things I take out of that is, having been thinking and teaching about assurance for 25 years in different ways, writing about it and supervising PhDs on it and whatever, I discovered what it meant in a real way in that experience. But that experience was not an experience of the closeness of God, and there was nothing like that at all. It was an experience of utter desolation, to be honest. And as I've said publicly before, I probably for 3 months, I was, I think the technical term is experiencing suicidal ideations repeatedly. But I think that sense of assurance, for want of a better word, was what kept me from ever taking those things seriously. So I'd probably draw back from some of that. We should look for assurance elsewhere than experience, just because right now, for me, I can't conceive of assurance that isn't experiential. But I don't want to make that the kind of if I don't feel something when I pray, or if I don't hear clear divine guidance or whatever, then I've got nothing. for me, it just came down to when everything else was gone, what I had was a conviction that in Jesus God held on to me, and that wasn't. Yeah, well, I'll stop going around in circles.
Yeah. I guess the other thing, but I want to, Ewan, it looks like you want to contribute something. Is there was a community also? You know, you talked about that a minute ago. There was a community around you as well. Yeah, Ewan.
Oh, I just kind of forgotten I'd unmuted myself a while back.
Oh.
But yeah, I guess, yeah, it was interesting to me to return to the theme of assurance as a kind of kid who grew up in a strict Baptist church.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I guess in a way, you know, it was a kind of church with a mix of kind of Fullerite theology, and then there were a little scattering of even stricter Baptists from a kind of Gadsbyite background on the kind of edge of the church. And, you know, assurance was a massive word and a massive theme in there. And in a way, it struck me that, you know, it meant something very particular, and it played something of the same role maybe in that community that speaking in tongues does in lots of Pentecostal circles.
Yes.
But it was kind of, you know, there was a kind of an acid test of, you know, whether or not one was really saved, and that was to have this quite particular, you know, experiential you know, sense.
Yeah.
And I guess, oh, sorry, my phone's just ringing. I guess in a way, sorry, I'll just ignore that. In a way, you're talking about what you. Well, does someone else want to share? Because I'm gonna, and I'll maybe come back to that in a sec. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, and I know exactly what you're talking about. So I recently had a PhD student. He's now actually pastoring a couple of strict Baptist churches, little churches in Scotland, one in Dundee and one in a bit further north somewhere. But he'd grown up in a very strict Dutch Reformed context and been to the States to study and been through some interesting life experience of his own, and kind of landed on my doorstep saying wanted to do a PhD on assurance. So I said, and he ended up actually working on Samuel Rutherford, which, given that my current office was Samuel Rutherford's bedroom once, was and Rutherford has exactly this, you know, assurance is a rare and special gift that you will receive right at the end of your Christian life if you're lucky, and up to that point you can never really know, but you have to and when Martin started with me, this was very much the doctrine he'd grown up with and still held, and he's now pastoring in particular churches, so he's not lost that, but I think he did come to see the pastoral issues there. I mean, that John Colwell taught us a module on election Calvin to Bart or something. I can't remember the title, but yeah. And I do remember, I think it was Carl Martin actually did a seminar on William Perkins, and kind of concluded that given what Perkins was teaching, anybody who felt assurance was probably a hypocrite. And anybody who was actually saved was probably greatly doubtful. And he then said, who was it who followed Perkins? Sibbs, was it? In the same pastorate, can't remember anyway. Commented, you know, so-and-so came afterwards and no doubt inherited a lot of pastoral problems. And but yeah, it runs through Reformed and evangelical pastoral theology, because there is no sacramental, or there's no strong, adequately strong sacramentalism. You know, Luther in the end says baptism of some, I am baptized. And yes, absolutely, salvation by faith alone, and yada 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 yada. But in the end, the fact that he believes himself to be baptized, we can discuss that. Is the thing that he cannot let go of, and that is, and there's an objectivity to that there never is to an evangelical conversion story or a reformed account of faith, and the history is in many ways deeply sad, actually, of endless attempts to discover something that can be relied upon, which all fail, and some of the really great figures, John Bunyan, Jonathan Edwards, go through profound crises of faith because they've been told that you ought to experience a particular set of things in a particular order, or you ought never to experience this, or whatever that. And the attempts to construct some sort of reality that will give assurance leads them to only to doubt their own experience. And it's, I mean, you folks do more pastoral work than I do these days.
If I can switch the conversation slightly, what I think for me was interesting was where you start in the lecture, which is naming this interest in Celtic spirituality, ecumenism, the retreat movement, charismatic spirituality, to which I think, and you suggest this, I think you could have added Anabaptism. And so there was this flurry of discovery of spiritual movements, I think, really in the 1990s, which I think is really interesting, because it seemed to me that there was this desire for something richer than what people were getting in their Baptist tradition. So no one's going back to recover a Baptist tradition. They're going to these other places.
Yeah, I have a theory about this.
Yeah. Okay. But I think, and I'm not sure, and I think you have admitted this, I'm not sure that your reading of them was always, you were making a particular argument out of that, which I don't think is always fair on all of them. It seems to me that most people were just looking for a richer spirituality. They were looking for something there, which I think says something about church life, which is, it is that we do need to go back to traditions, and we do need to have that sense of renewal. That things, so Nigel in Challenge to Change at the beginning of the 90s says, we're still stuck in the Edwardian or Victorian age. We need that sense of renewal.
Yeah, but we weren't. So my theory is that we, in terms of British Baptist life, we pretty much entirely, it maybe some of the strict particular churches didn't, some of the grace churches, but most of us pretty much entirely bought in to a sort of pan-evangelical account of vibrant Christianity that's centered on mission. And so the heroes were missionaries, and you went to Keswick, and if you got the blessing, it was, you got the blessing because you were being called to the mission field. And in terms of the unofficial catalogue of saints, it was the missionaries. It was Jim Elliot and David Brainerd and Amy, what's her name, in Hong Kong, and go down the list. And it's still not dead. Krista, who heads up our work in Fusion Scotland, she's the director. She comes from 5 generations of missionary family. On one side, her great-great-grandfather, I think, was one of the Cambridge 7 who went with C.T. Studd. And there are churches, including my own, where you say that, you know, there are 20 people who immediately sit up. But mission means colonialism to anyone young today. And so the stories that told us what vibrant Christianity looked like started to become extraordinarily difficult to tell. I don't know if anyone else remembers the kind of drama that BMS toured in '92, where kind of the 200th anniversary, and it was suffused by this discomfort that there was not just plenty wrong in our story, but we weren't totally convinced that our story was in any way redeemable.
And so we began to look elsewhere, is that?
Yeah, so whereas, you know, whereas in the 60s, perhaps last well, Willie Still was still doing it in the 70s up here in Scotland, and astonishing ministry. Church never grew because he sent out all these young people to the mission field. But you know, over 20 years, he must have sent out 500 missionaries from the church. I mean, his book on pastoral ministry ends with the comment that the shepherds of Israel were tasked with caring for and bringing up the sheep so that they could be pure and unblemished and fit to go to the altar. And that was what he understood his ministry to be doing. You know, the altar was the mission field. I kind of feel he's a voice from a different age, but he ought to be one I find inspiring. But you know, if I try to talk to my students about mission, we're straight into post-colonial analysis. And I mean, I've got ways of dealing with this. Really, Robert Woodbury's work on democracy, and you know, last time I did a talk for the CU here, no, the time before last, I spent some time pointing out to them that we have this narrative that the church is the enemy of gay marriage, but actually, if you look at a map of countries which have legalized same-sex marriage around the world, it's pretty much a map of countries which had a significant evangelical Protestant mission movement. And I can put that story together. I don't find it difficult, but and so, you know, but you've got to fight to say missionary with politically aware kids or young people these days, and so you know, my church still has a bunch of mission biographies in paperback sitting at the back of a cupboard somewhere. But whereas once we'd have been giving them one by one to the Young People's Fellowship, now the Young People's Fellowship is called something much more exciting, and none of them would have any desire at all to look at any of these books. And we had to find something different. And yeah, I think we were casting around.
Yeah. But see, so what emerges is this eclectic range of new things, which I think then tack into a kind of consumerism really as well. You know, so Spring Harvest with its albums, so that's the charismatic movement. Celtic Daily Prayer, Northumbria Community print that and publish it so you can share it. Iona doing their own
and make a lot of money out of it.
Sure. But Iona doing something similar. Yeah. It's something then that actually, I guess at one point was fairly strange. You know, Iona out there and out of Hebrides suddenly becomes something that we can reach. We don't even have to go there. we can have that.
Although
that,
of course the main house of the Ionian community in Glasgow and always has been.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it's still a sense of this then suddenly moved out. And I think if I think about the 1990s, I didn't want to be a missionary. I wanted to be Matt Redmond.
Yeah, well, but again, that's doing a saints, and
yeah,
you could choose, Matt Redmond and Mike Pilavat.
Maybe not mine now, but yeah.
Is John Wimber still? I can't remember. Or you can choose your Anabaptists, although not John Howard Yoder. Or you can choose your Celtic saints who, at least whatever they did wrong has been lost in the midst of time, or you can choose your global saints, with Desmond Tutu probably top of the list. You're always looking for people who embody image forth a vibrant and Christian discipleship that's plausibly lived today, and the point at which the sort of missionary career of Carey or Brainerd or Judson became unimaginable in those terms was a really decisive or a real crisis for British evangelicalism, including pretty much all of us Baptists. Yeah.
But at the same time, also though, as that's happening, we're also hitting church decline. So that suddenly actually the mission field is a lot more local. And so it comes back to the apologetic, I guess. How do we reach the new thing? Well, it maybe this Celtic Christianity thing will do it. Maybe this charismatic Christianity, this Anabaptist thing will do it. So there's, I guess, is there still with that? And I think I don't want to push that too hard, because I think some of those people who are within those traditions were deeply committed, but in some, I guess, expressions of it becomes a faddism. Ian Stackhouse, we jump from one thing to the next, hoping that will be the apologetic answer, which will unlock renewal.
Yeah. I was last summer. I was at a meeting of the European Baptist Federation with the Council of Protestant Churches in Europe, because I know how to party. We were talking about there was 25 years ago. So the Council of Protestant Churches in Europe is what the Leuenberg Fellowship became, and it's one of the most significant ecumenical things that's happened. So it started with the Lutherans and the Reformed rescinding their mutual anathemas in the original Leuenberg Agreement, but now it's grown to include Methodists and I think the Anglicans are part of it, but and they've all agreed to interchangeability of ministry. So my friend and colleague Katrin, who is a German Lutheran minister ordained, can minister, officiate, hold office, whatever, in the Church of Scotland and the Episcopal Church up here because they're of the Leuenberg Fellowship. So 25 years ago, there was a conversation, and it was a bit of a disaster by all accounts. We had this 25 years on, and nobody was expecting very much out of it. But actually, it went really well. And one of the reasons it went really well, one of them was that a certain generation of Lutheran theologians have thankfully all died. But another one was this very strong sense that we'd been talking about being about church as counterculture, and 25 years ago that made no sense at all to Lutherans and Presbyterians and Reformed and whatever, whereas now they don't know how to do it, but they do understand what we're talking about. And so I do think there was, and if going back to the Anabaptists, if monastic practices, whatever it might be, with the charismatic stuff, it was the March for Jesus, and it was the the charismatic stuff did at its best always turn out You're not here just to have a bless up. You're here to be commissioned and empowered and emboldened to go, you know. And so Matt finishes the Face Down album with you know, let worship be the fuel for missions flame or whatever, and Tim Hughes finishes whatever with send us out, send us out, send us out, you know, and all of this stuff. And so but if that was where we were finding a recovery of our own best instincts as a countercultural movement, and for me this is very foreign, because I came, as I say in the lecture, I converted at the age of 19 from a totally non-Christian context, and so for me conversion church was always, and family gathering still is, profoundly countercultural. When we gather as a family at Christmas, there's the tension in the air. Are you going to mess up our Christmas celebration by insisting on going to church? And so, you know, that was foreign to me, and perhaps it isn't in the lecture because I didn't realise that it wasn't foreign to everybody. But I do think that there was this thing about recovery, and it is. And I think you're right to say, you know, you can do the church decline thing by saying it started in 1850, and actually the graphs look nice if you draw them from 1850, but Callum Brown's Death of Christian Britain is a really interesting argument to the effect that most of what happens between 1850 and 1950 is a decline in the frequency of church attendance, not a decline in the number of church attenders. So obviously not in 1850, but you know, by the time you get into the middle of the 20th century, every family's got a car. And so every family is going away one weekend in 4 to visit relatives or to have a weekend at the seaside or whatever. And so suddenly, you know, folks who in 1850 were at 2 services and Sunday school every Sunday are coming to 1 service every other Sunday. And you think you've lost 7 out of 8 people, but you haven't. You've just lost 7 out of 8 attendances. But then Callum, I mean, he wants to blame Beatles fairly obviously. Callum said in 63, he's that specific. It falls apart. And his account is it's about plausible narrative structures. So 1963 is the last time the Archers would have run a storyline that followed a Christian redemptive arc, he says. I can't claim to have listened to the Archers closely enough to know. And that's the decisive change, and that is a massive cultural change. If he's right, you know, if all the folk who didn't come to church nonetheless assumed that the basic rationality of human life and human morality was a Christian story, then we were in one place. And if they suddenly stopped assuming that, then suddenly we were in a very, very different place.
Yeah.
I've talked too much, sorry.
We've got to 9 o'clock. Steve, thank you for your lecture. Thank you for reflecting with us again on it and some of the issues that, again, I think what we're discovering as we revisit each lecture, there is something about them that speaks into where we are today. So actually, I guess in that sense, that's very McIntyre, and that they're part of our living tradition rather than our dead tradition. And so hopefully from us being on this conversation, others who may watch it, we can begin to kind of engage and think through those issues for our Baptist present as well. We'll be back next month, I think, by revisiting Kate Coleman's lecture on being human and some reflections around Black womanist theology together. So if you're around for that, you'll be very welcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone.